take it away. All right, all set.
Thanks, Catherine. And thanks everyone for joining us this evening. I am extremely excited to be able to talk with you all about some of the work that I've been doing in Bermuda over the last, since 2006. My math isn't up to snuff tonight. So really, I should just sort of foreground. Everyone see my screen okay? Foreground that my background as an archaeologist and vernacular
Well, I don't hear the. I don't.
Sorry. My background as an archaeologist and vernacular architecture scholar, most of the time I'm excavating everyday buildings and everyday sites, but it's pretty hard to escape the fortifications of the island on Bermuda. And just before I get started, show of hands, either digital or physical, how many people have been to the island before? No? No one's been? Folks in St. Augustine have been there. How long ago? You can unmute and talk.
Yeah, we were there 2 years ago, sailed out of Boston.
Oh, wow, that's great.
Yeah.
So
it was a 2-day trip by sea to Bermuda. Then we got 3 days on the island and then back to Boston.
that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Was that your first time there?
Yes.
Yeah. What'd you think of it?
It was amazing. And the funny part was the fortress that you're showing here. I spent the entire day in the fortress, going through the archives, going through the big house structure, walk out onto a wall, and I see my wife down on the beach. We waved at each other. It was a glorious moment.
Well, I have to say that if you all have not had the chance to go to Bermuda, I strongly encourage you to go there. It's an amazing place. It really, for me, I mean, having lived in Charleston, it really is. I mean, it feels like Charleston. The hospitality and the people. We like to say in Bermuda that, Charleston is another parish of the island. I realize that Charlestonians like to say the opposite, but in all fairness, we were there first. But what I want to do today is I want to walk us through the evolution of fortifications on the island from the early 17th century all the way up until the 20th century, and then end by talking about some of the contemporary issues that are facing these sites and the island as a whole relative to their heritage resources and with respect to heritage tourism as well. And so my talk tonight is in sort of 4 parts. First, a prologue to sort of provide us a framing of the island. The second part is defending the summers, which many of you know that the island was a joint stock company, a private entity within the British Empire up until 1684. And then after that, talking about defending the empire in the sense of after the American Revolution, Bermuda becomes a prominent location for the Atlantic Fleet, the North Atlantic Fleet in particular, up until the middle of the 20th century. And it's not until the 1957 when the British actually formally pull out of the island and the garrison leaves. One thing to also note is that Bermuda is still technically a colony. In the 21st century, we call that an overseas dependent territory or overseas territory, meaning that there is still a royally appointed governor that is appointed for 3 years on the island. But there is a local assembly that is elected that handles all domestic affairs, but foreign policy and international issues are handled by the British government. And so it really occupies this liminal place within the geopolitical world of the 21st century. Ironically, in the 17th century, Bermuda was the smallest British Atlantic holding in the world at just 12 square miles. Today, it is the largest holding of the British Empire. So it is this absolute sort of reversal of its place within the Atlantic world and within the global economy as well. So I should also preface this to say that at the end, I have some resources if you're really interested in this kind of work. Edward Harris essentially and physically and metaphorically wrote the book on fortifications in Bermuda. He has been a champion of the forts on the island since he returned from England to become director of the Maritime Museum in the 1970s, and he's since retired. So there's a lot of literature out there, but I really want to march us through how fortifications are this index of Bermuda's changing place within the Atlantic world and really the globe and the empire. So first, I just want to frame this discussion, as you all have talked about in Quebec and St. Augustine and in Charleston, just sort of why forts are important. And the photograph you're seeing here is not on Bermuda. This photograph is from a fortification called High Knoll Fort in St. Helena Island off the coast of Namibia in Africa. Many of you all will know St. Helena. It's where they sent Napoleon the second time, I joke. And so I was lucky enough just before the COVID outbreak to do some documentation work for the government there, but it really got me thinking about the global network of fortifications around the Atlantic world. And so the fortifications that you will see today are being built at the same time as those fortifications on St. Helena throughout the Caribbean. And so we really need to think about these heritage resources within this sort of global age of empire, particularly in the late 18th and early 19th century. And secondly, thinking about, for me, originally trained as an anthropologist, thinking about fortifications as creating this barrier within the colonial world and creating this othering relationship with indigenous groups, particularly in North America, and also in terms of other colonial powers. And so they are these marks on the landscape that define space. And on Bermuda, being surrounded by ocean, it really does create this sort of othering effect on the island. So just keep that in mind. If you have a chance to go to St. Helena, I strongly encourage you to do that too. It's just a quick 15-hour flight from Atlanta down to Johannesburg, and then a regional jet where you refuel in the middle of the desert in Namibia, and then fly 4 hours over the ocean with enough fuel to turn around to come back. It's perfectly easy. So I strongly encourage you to take that trip once COVID comes back. Oh, and there's only one flight a week, or it's a 7-day journey from Cape Town on a boat. So it's truly one of the most isolated places I've ever been. So again, just sort of as I think about these places, and it's one of the reasons, as Catherine said, I work in a lot of different places, is because I like to understand and think about the relationships between these different spaces, whether it be my work in Jamaica or Barbados or in the Low Country or in Bermuda or in St. Helena. So we really need to be thinking about these, as I'm sure the previous lecturers have talked about, really thinking about these places within the network of the Atlantic world. And all that landmass and all that ocean, and then we have the island of Bermuda, which is only 12 square miles. And today, 60,000 people live there. A large majority of them, close to 70%, are of African descent. Enslaved Africans first came to the island in the early 17th century. And so, ironically, this place that is literally a tiny speck on this Encyclopedia Britannica map of the Atlantic world played an outspoken role in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries in the British Atlantic world, and really in the larger sort of project of European expansion during that time. And so to give you a sense of the complexity and the breadth of all these fortifications, here is the GIS map that I pulled from the government that shows just the major fortifications within 12 square miles. And if you count those up, you'll see there are over 30 mentioned there. That those are just those that have shape files within the cultural resources of the island. There are over 90 fortifications on Bermuda on 12 square miles. Arguably, it is one of the most, if not the most. I'm sure that Nick Butler, who's here, would tell me if I'm right or wrong. It is potentially one of the heaviest fortified per square miles landmass in the world. Nick?
Yep, sounds good to me.
I will also say that I know this for certain. Bermuda has the highest per capita number of golf courses in the world, with 14 before the pandemic. So more than one golf course per square mile if you want to go play golf with some pretty nice spots. So what are some major threads that I'm going to talk about over the next half hour or so? So really, as I said, fort building in Bermuda sort of mirrors the island's sociocultural trajectory in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. There are more than 90 forts in various states of conservation on 12 square miles, constructed and modified over these 4 centuries of occupation. Ironically, other than an attack by one Spanish vessel in 1614, Bermuda was never attacked directly by anyone. And so we constantly talk about, this island paranoia of the Spanish are going to attack, the French are going to attack, the Americans are going to attack, the Germans are going to attack in World War II. It would never come to pass. And we'll talk a little bit about that paranoia and how that manifests in fortification buildings. Today, the forts are managed by the government. They are government property. This is a British territory as well. They're all grade HM. That is the highest classification of protection in the British planning system. And they're managed not by, ironically, by the cultural resource officer, the heritage officer as they call them, but they're managed by the environmental branch of conservation services. And now, as we'll talk about at the end of the talk, they really form this key component of heritage tourism, not just from a programmatic, but from an infrastructure point of view. So those are things to keep in mind as we march through 400 years of fortification on Bermuda. So I will say Charleston connections before I get started. Justin did a pretty great thesis at the College of Charleston and Clemson program, where he mapped out many of those Bermuda stone buildings, which you all know throughout Charleston are located. And so if you have a chance, you can actually access this for free, I believe still, through the Clemson thesis program. Don't read my thesis. It's on there too. It's going to come out as an article revised pretty soon. So, and then also I like to show the bird's eye map of Charleston, because if you look very closely, and Catherine and Nick can tell me exactly where, somewhere down here, there is a notation of a Bermuda stone house on the bird's eye map of Charleston. So I won't talk a lot about the Charleston connections to Bermuda, but they are strong and frequent from the founding of Charleston onwards into the 19th century. So things to keep in mind. So Bermuda is 600 miles from the nearest point on the east coast of North America. So Cape Hatteras is the nearest point. It's about 626 miles. I like to round it up to 600 as the crow flies. And so its distance from North America prevented it from being settled by any indigenous groups. And so when, and here you see sort of the geology of the island here, what is above water today is actually the southern rim of a now dormant or extinct volcano. And you can see, can you see my pointer at all on there? Yep. Let me turn on my laser pointer. You can see the caldera here. And what this is now, particularly on the northern side, this forms a reef system. So the island itself had its own natural geological formation that provided protection. And so you can't just sail a vessel through the reefs here. It's too shallow. I mean, in some places it comes up to my knees. That's how shallow it is with the reef system. And so the caldera actually only provides one major entrance into the interior bay here, and then a very tiny one down here, which was never used. And so you really have a natural fortification system because of the fact that this caldera and sea level rise and changing nature of the island above water provided. And so that really dictated how building in the 17th century in particular went about it. So keep that in mind as we march through these slides. So here again, this will be our base map for the entire lecture, just sort of to orient you. We'll first talk about St. George's up here in the upper right-hand corner of the 17th century settlement. We'll talk about Dockyard down here, and then we'll also talk about the city of Hamilton, which is centrally located and the capital from 1850 onwards. So many of you have probably know the story of the founding of Bermuda, the Sea Venture, a part of the third supply to the Virginia colony, was headed for Jamestown, and it got blown off course in a tempest of Shakespearean fame, and wrecked on the island of Bermuda. And George Somers, who was in charge of that fleet, essentially encountered a landscape that was devoid of indigenous occupation. And so this is a very sort of famous painting of Bermuda, of the Bermuda hogs. So Catherine and I were joking about hogs in the Ace Basin before we came on. There are plenty of hogs on Bermuda left by Spanish sailors that knew of the island from the middle of the 15th century. And essentially because of the reef system, often ships would become wreck upon the reefs. And so you have a series of Spanish shipwrecks on the outer part of the reef system. And basically they'd hang out until someone would come and get them. But it wasn't until, and this was all happening in 1609, it wasn't until 1612, with the British attempting to continue to increase their presence in the Atlantic world in the 17th century, that the Somers Island was formed first as a part of the Virginia Company of London, and then broke off into its own private joint stock company. And you all know sort of the origins of these joint stock companies, the piecemeal, I like to joke, Thatcherite approach to the colonization project in the 17th century by the British. And so what happens in the 17th century, because it is a private holding, the Somers Island Company, joint stock based in London, sends over a series of settlers, first with the plow in 1612, and then continued replenishment to set up this colony. And essentially they wanted to mirror the Virginia colony. They said, we've been having tons of trouble with the indigenous groups in Virginia, but we're starting to grow tobacco fruitfully. But we want to try that in Bermuda. There's no indigenous group here. And so now, instead of having to isolate and fortify our plantation landscapes like we do at Jamestown or at Martin's Hundred, we can basically have free reign of this island to try and grow tobacco. Unfortunately, the soil, which has a limestone bedrock, is awful for tobacco, and it very quickly doesn't do anything. And there's this short sort of curve where in the early 1620s, Bermuda is actually exporting more tobacco than Virginia combined. But then, as you know, you need crop rotation with tobacco, and so they don't have the space to do that rotation. So the soil essentially becomes exhausted after one sort of major sort of round of growing. While all that's being sorted out in terms of this money-making venture of the 17th century, the first series of governors, really led by Nathaniel Butler, who is chronicled in John Smith's history of Virginia in the Somers Island, really sets up this fortification construction process and system whereby they are rapidly defending the island. And so what you see here appears in John Smith's chronicle. It also appears in Butler's History of the Bermudas, which is available through the National Museum Press, which is a great sort of chronicling of the first sort of 40 years of occupation on the island. But we in the 17th century Bermuda, because not much is left, we use this as a blueprint to understand that 17th century landscape that was centered in St. George's. And you can see alone the fortifications here. If you look very closely in the center of this map, we actually have a key to where all these are. If you look very closely, so H, G, F, E, D, F. And really within the first 20 years of occupation of just the east end of the island, you have this major fortification construction, and all to defend St. George's, which is the center of, it's the capital of the colony during the joint stock period. And so we'll talk a little bit about each one of these fortifications and why they are where they are, because of that geology and geography that dictates how settlement played out. And so here is the Norwood map of the east end of Bermuda, and you can see again all these forts that are dotted all along the coasts that are strategically placed to protect St. George's. Again, in the 17th century in particular, there is this high paranoia of Spanish attack. At the same time, you can imagine a society that is on a 12 square mile island that has not a lot to do other than grow tobacco. Keeping hands busy will keep them out of trouble, as it were. You have to remember that people in Bermuda in the 17th century, they're looking for things to do. They're constantly needing to have tasks to keep them from sort of, going crazy, essentially. And so you can see here's St. George's represented by a fortification, a Warwick Fort, which no longer stands, a small town, and then these series of fortifications around this east end. Not much in the way of any settlement in anything outside of St. George's happens during these first opening decades of the 17th century. All of this is essentially untouched until we get into mid-century. And so here's our base map for the East End, St. George's again. And really what the focus is during the 17th century is defending two areas where you can come in and penetrate the reef system and potentially attack St. George's. Remember, this is a money-making venture. And so even though they're not making much money, they're sending off tobacco. The English are also worried that if the Spanish attack Bermuda, they could use it as a staging ground for a large-scale invasion of the eastern seaboard of North America as well. And so the two areas that they focus on here, this entry right and around St. David's Island, and then down here in a site called Castle Roads. I will sort of note really quickly, this cut right here, if you look very closely, you see this deep cut. That's actually a 20th century invention to allow cruise ships to come in the most direct way. So you can squeeze a cruise ship in here, not one of the mega things that are crazy, but you can slot a small cruise ship in here. And I've seen people, reach their hand out from the shore and can be able to touch the boat. That's how tight a fit it is. But these are the two areas that were most heavily fortified in the 17th century. And so because the cut coming in is incredibly narrow, there's no settlement to the west. These are the two only areas where they could get at. And I should also note, all of this in here is all reclaimed land from the 20th century. So this was a huge empty area, as you see in this map. So this is where the airport is today, which is all reclaimed land. And so in Castle Roads, as we're looking at the John Smith depiction, we have two major fortifications on this cut here. And so to the west, we have King's Castle, which you see here, and then Southampton Fort. Both of these have been heavily excavated by a professor at the College of William and Mary, where I went 10,000 years ago. Norm Barca and Edward Harris excavated King's Castle and parts of Southampton Fort. And so here's an aerial image of this cut that comes through. This is King's Castle here, and this is Southampton Fort. And zooming in on King's Castle, we have basically three fortifications on this tiny speck of land. We have Stewart Fort here, Devonshire Redoubt, and then a later fortification over here on the western side of the island. And so Seward Fort from 1614, you can see many of the firing positions survive. The keep here, which functioned as a storehouse, but you can really see how these fortifications were cut directly into the limestone of the island and of the bedrock. And that's the one thing to remember in 17th century Bermuda. You really don't have any other stone building other than the fortifications and the primary public buildings. Everything else was timber, because as we see in Virginia, there is this trajectory, this mentality that we're going to come to the New World, we're going to make our money, and we're going to leave. Just like we see with the Virginia House in the Chesapeake. And so there isn't until the second or third generation a major investment in domestic architecture when they realize, A, Bermuda's not so bad, and B, maybe we might want to have a stone building in case the hurricane comes. Those are the two pressures that impress them to shift from timber framing into stone architecture. So this is Seward Fort dating from 1614. And here you can see the arrangement. This is from, I should say, and I'll mention this at the end, all these forts that I'm talking about in this first half of the lecture are now part of the World Heritage Site for St. George's and its fortification. So there's been a pile of research done into these fortifications as a part of that nomination process. And so you can see here, this is this area here, the firing positions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 firing positions with an upper fort, the captain's house, which was excavated by Norman Barca, who found actually their midden and determined that they actually ate the best out here. They got the best fish relative to those deposits that were excavated in St. George's. So they were trying to keep them happy and well nourished as a part of their stationing out here in Castle Roads at King's Castle, and then the cook's house here. And this is all that remains of the captain's house today. And you can see the heavy stone fortification, but not much else survives. As you all know from these lectures and elsewhere, pieces of artillery are constantly being moved around and repurposed, or just completely discarded, melted down as new technology evolves. And so there's not much ordnance left on many of these 17th century forts. And this is what it looked like in the 1930s. So you can sort of see that integrity doesn't really survive beyond the 17th century fortification. Here, Devonshire Redoubt, which you can see here, is on the north and west side of the island. Again, more firing, more fortified positions. You know, this is not even a quarter of a square mile in terms of size, and it's heavily fortified. In this case, with 7 additional guns as a part of this. And so they have the battery that's facing the harbor, and then the battery that, should a ship make it through Castle Roads, they would be able to fire at them from the stern of the vessel as they cut through. And you can see we have several periods of occupation here, and we'll talk about this in a second. This 1624 phase, and then this later 1800, 19th century phase as a part of the refortification of the East End after the capital leaves St. George's in 1815, which I'll get to. And then this is that later fortification as well, the landward fort on the western side. Now, just across the cut, Southampton Island is another fortification just on the other side of Castle Roads. And here you see again this aerial image from the 1980s. This dates to 1621. Another fortified settlement here. Again, a centralized courtyard magazine with a keep just like at Castle Roads. Several firing positions, 8 firing positions directly into that only area where any ship could come through as well. One of the things to remember as we're looking at this before we move up here to the St. David's area is you'll notice throughout this lecture that there are no fortifications on the south side of the island other than here at Castle Roads. And that's primarily because the reef system prevents a ship from being able to get close enough to fire on shore. And so you see this line out here, this drops off several miles into the Atlantic Ocean. Literally, you can swim out to that drop off. It's only 600 yards offshore. And so there's no need to defend that position, that South Shore position, because of the natural fortifications of the island. Additionally, here, we're moving up into the St. David's area. They fortified this second cut in which a potential enemy vessel could enter with Paget and Smith's fort. Here you can see again depicted on the John Smith representation, both constructed by 1624 in this area. Again, this paranoia of the Spanish attacking. Smith's fort dates of 1613, again excavated by Edward Harris and Norman Barca. Not much recovered in the way of archaeological evidence other than piles and piles and piles of fish bone. That's really all that's left of life, everyday life on on these early 17th century forts. And then, unfortunately, nothing survives of Paget Fort. It's been completely blown away from a hurricane in the early 20th century. And so in addition to those two fortified positions, if we remember from the John Smith map, a smaller series of fortifications are dotting St. George's. And so you have what would become Fort St. Catherine, a fortified position here, Warwick Fort, which was blown away in the 1980s because of the desire to put a golf course in, which has since now been blown up once more to put a new golf course in, designed by Greg Norman. And smaller series of bastions throughout the East End. And so the center of this entire complex of fortifications, however, was the State House. And so as sort of the last line of defense, here you see the town of St. George's. The last line of defense was the State House, which here in that John Smith depiction are the very sort of simple timber framed houses of St. George's. This is the church, Warwick Fort sitting to the north, somewhere in here, now been blown away. And then the State House, which you see here on the right, is idealized. It's this Baroque design building, which is completely out of place. But Butler talks about how he creates this as the last line of defense should the Spanish attack, which again, they never did, as you see it here. With firing positions from a flat roof, they very quickly abandoned this design because they realized an island that gets, 28 days of rainfall a month, having a flat roof is not ideal for water management. And so they abandoned this. But you can sort of see on the left here, further Pembroke Fort, which doesn't survive, Charles Fort, which doesn't survive, all to the north of the town. These are sort of the smaller pieces of fortification. Should there be a vessel that gets through Castle Roads and St. David's Cut into the harbor? Really, they're really banking on Castle Roads and St. David's Cut to protect them. And so here you see, this is a map of all of the fortifications in the East End, just to reinforce this complex system of defense in the 17th century during the Somers Island occupation. And really, we need to think about this as an investment in the protection of private holdings of the empire. Because if it wasn't fortified, all the investors back in London would lose all of the money that they dumped into this venture. Owing to Bermuda's marginal place within the Atlantic world relative to larger efforts in Jamaica and Barbados and North America, the Somers Island Company actually hung on through the 1680s until its charter was revoked. They weren't making any money. They were making money off of the docking fees that they could charge vessels for shipping the various goods from Bermuda back to London. Because you remember, Bermuda during the 17th century was not on the open market. It wasn't within the Atlantic marketplace. It had to strictly move goods within this narrowly defined Somers Island Company mandate, which eventually is thrown off in 1684, and it becomes a crown colony. And it is, as I said, one of the last ones to hang on. So after that, we enter into this period of neglect after the 17th century as it becomes a crown holding, because Britain is embroiled in larger affairs at the beginning of the 18th century and through the period of the American Revolution. And so Bermuda, instead of being now a closed system, becomes essentially what we can think of as, if you've ever flown through Memphis Airport, or if you've ever flown through Louisville, anyone know why those two airports are important in the 21st century? No? No one? Memphis is the hub for FedEx. Louisville is the hub for UPS. So if you order your iPhone from China, it's going to come through Memphis and then go to where it is. Bermuda was the same way. In the early 18th century, 95% of all vessels crossing the Atlantic came within 3 miles of Bermuda because of the Gulf Stream. And so it really is adjacent to the highway. It was not only the FedEx hub, but it was the rest stop of vessels crossing, particularly from west to east, heading back to London markets. And so Bermudians capitalize on this strategic position and essentially become the FedEx or UPS men of the 18th century. And so they're shuttling goods back and forth across the Atlantic world. And here you see the famous Bermuda sloop, which is made of cedar from the island that's endemic, that really is ideal with a shallow draft to go up many of the rivers on the eastern seaboard. And so Bermuda enters this mercantile period that historians call the Maritime Revolution, and not much fortification building happens because it is insulated by North American and growing Caribbean holdings. People are essentially making Bermuda a backwater in the 18th century from a military point of view, but economically it becomes this major sort of center. And you can see here with more sloops here in Flats Harbor, which only is 10 feet deep. You can run these Bermuda sloops up into many sort of shallow areas, and that's why they were so versatile, and they were incredibly fast as well. But in the age of the American Revolution, Bermuda starts to play a more prominent sort of contentious role. So by the third quarter of the 18th century, the focus of empire starts to shift back toward Bermuda. And the famous sort of gunpowder plot, which many of you have probably heard, in which a series of American sympathizers led by Henry Tucker stole all of the British gunpowder from the eastern stores, what would become Fort Victoria, and shipped the powder to American forces in the South and on the northern front as well. And so with this act, there are these great tensions between the garrison in Bermuda, the appointed governors and administrative officials, and the local Bermudians who are pro-American because of their familial ties to North America. So if you've been to Colonial Williamsburg and you've been into the St. George Tucker house, this is St. George Tucker's father. So St. George left St. George's, Bermuda, to go to law school at William & Mary, where I went to school. And so there is this tight connection between North America and Bermuda. And so with that, now you have this colonial tension. And eventually, after the American Revolution and the loss of North America, Bermuda now regains this important position within the late 18th and early 19th century Atlantic world. And so you have this major shift from St. George's now to Hamilton and then to Dockyard. And so whereas St. George's was the center of the world, the center of the Bermudian world in the 17th and 18th century, now they shift to the new town of Hamilton. But before they do that, in the 1830s, there is a series of rebuilding projects of the fortifications to shore up this eastern end. And so if you look at the Smith engraving, this is what St. Catherine's Fort looks like in 1612. This is what St. Catherine's Fort looks like in 1830, after a massive rebuilding project to fortify this eastern end. So essentially, they don't have to worry about it. Similarly, here down, we talked about a Martello Tower. Sorry, I went ahead of myself. Another fortification at Fort George was constructed here on top of the hill commanding St. George's Harbor for fortifications. Fort Victoria was constructed in 1840 near where St. Catherine's is, up here. That has now been destroyed by a Holiday Inn in the 1940s and then imploded and now completely destroyed to make way for a later hotel. I always like to show that is, it's up this way in this image. And so Fort Victoria, Fort Albert all buttress the position, and then a Martello Tower was put in the 1830s, again, owing to that Atlantic cosmopolitan design of fortifications in the 1830s as well. So you have the second period of construction in the early part of the 19th century, not because they're trying to protect St. George's, it's because they don't care about it anymore and they don't want to have to bother with it. And so as long as there's a garrison of British troops at these forts, they could essentially leave the East End alone. More photographs of the Martello Tower. All the focus now shifts to the new capital at Hamilton. which becomes the capital in 1815, and then in the 1820s to the Royal Naval Dockyard on Ireland Island. So this is what Hamilton looks like in 1815. By 1857, they now have all these public buildings that are made in Bermuda stone. So here you see the Parliament building, several of the support structures, and other administrative buildings that are constructed by mid-century. But Ireland Island, in terms of fortifications, really becomes the centerpiece of Bermuda's focus beginning in the 1820s. And so the folks who've been there on the boat, they sailed into Dockyard and they saw this center of the fortress, Bermuda, which becomes the center of the northern British Atlantic fleet. It becomes the resupply center now that Philadelphia and New York and Charleston and Annapolis, all those ports are no longer available. And so there's this rapid pullback to Bermuda in the 1820s. And because of its central location, it becomes the idealized place for the Royal Naval Dockyard, which essentially you have to think about as the resupply and refitting of all these naval vessels in the Northern Atlantic. So this is the plans that they went through as of 1830, and we'll walk through the various elements of the dockyard. But essentially, we're going to be talking about the commissioner's house here, the barracks here, and then all the stores and services, whether it be cooperage, whether it be storage of goods, the victualling yard for resupply, all these service the North Atlantic fleet beginning in the 1820s. So here, Commissioner's House, which is this amazing piece of architecture in and of itself. I could give just a lecture on this. It is the first, you would never know it, it is the first cast iron roof truss system in the world. Not just in the Western Hemisphere, it is the first cast iron roof in the world. Designed between, designed in the 1810s after John Soane's architecture, that was very popular in metropolitan London at the time. You can see it has these exterior, I always say, verandas. We can, argue with Lewis Nelson about what you call these exterior spaces, these exterior walkways outside of the envelope of the building, whether we call them piazzas or verandas or porches, but it really speaks to that sort of high style Georgian architecture of the period. And it sits out exposed on three sides to the harbor and then to the bay over here on the other side. And that's really why they wanted to experiment with cast iron production, was because they thought, what is the most rugged place we could send this kind of technology to be tested? And the Commissioner's House fit the bill in the 1820s. And so here you see a rendering of the eastern elevation. You can see you've got these great welcoming arm stairs with this centralized door with this fan light, massive windows, and really sort of speaks to the place of the Commissioner of Dockyard, not just in Bermuda, but in the Atlantic world. This structure is more finely finished than the Governor's House, than the Admiral's House at the time. And so it really is, it is the prime architectural jewel of Bermuda during this period. So with the Commissioner's House here on the end, all fortified with ramparts and firing positions. On the other end, they construct what's known as Casemates Barracks, which you can see here looking from the Commissioner's House. This is a Tupper image from the 1830s. You can see, from the 1850s, you can see Casemates Barracks here off in the distance. And so they constructed both ends first. They constructed the Commissioner's House in 1820, the barracks in the 1820s as well into the 30s, and then filled in with all those support structures in the middle that we'll talk about very briefly. Here you see the Commissioner's House again with support buildings, cooperage, forges, and there's Casemates Barracks off in the distance. And so here it is in 1824, a massive barracks construction again to house the garrison on the eastern end. Ironically, this becomes a jail after the garrison leaves, and serves as such up until the 1970s, when then it goes sort of over the wall. But you can see this massive wall that protects and fortifies the dockyard by land, in addition to the sea protections as well. And this is what it actually looks like from a laser scan that I didn't do. Wolfgang Nürnbauer did that back in the early 2010s, which we'll talk about in a minute. You can see what's left of this massive barracks complex that supported the dockyard. Then centrally located as well, the Victualling Yard from the 1850s was again this sort of hub for resupply of vessels, and then the clock tower stores as well, which again from the 1850s shows how they started at both ends and worked their way in piecemeal, providing that support system for the resupply of vessels. After the American Civil War, Bermudians, as many of you know, supported the Confederacy. Blockade runners regularly came to Hamilton and Bermuda. There was this, again, this sort of third wave of paranoia that the Americans, given that the Union won, the Americans would now attack Bermuda and take it back. And so a series of support forts, first at Scour Hill, if here's Dockyard here at the end, at Scour Hill in the 1860s, has a commanding position over the harbor should any Union vessels attempt to attack the island. And here you can see Scour Hill's position within the broader inner harbor, looking down toward Hamilton. And then Hamilton Fort here in the 1870s was constructed, but again, was never really properly used to defend Hamilton as the capital of Bermuda, worried about that American attack, which would never come. Today, Fort Hamilton has been proposed to be redeveloped as a part of hotel complexes, but they also throw an amazing Halloween party here, where this becomes a major Halloween haunted house. That's pretty wild down in the moat here, which is terrifying to say the least. And here you see today, it actually functions as a botanical garden, which is quite genteel. Fortifications, this sort of paranoia. One last thing before I move into the conservation challenges. Alexandra Battery and other fortifications on the eastern end were actually redeveloped in World War I and World War II, worried about, particularly in World War II, German U-boats. And there's actually documented cases of U-boats being within several hundred yards of Bermuda. And there was a worry that if Bermuda was invaded by the Germans and Axis forces, it could again, like that 17th century paranoia, be a staging ground for a large-scale invasion of North America. Again, that would never come, but that was a fear of the Allied forces. So finally, today, Bermuda not being a major military installation anymore. As I said, the garrison pulled back in 1957. Now Bermuda is a tourism destination. You can see here the COVID-friendly confines of Horseshoe Bay. This was taken pre-COVID. And so beach culture, heritage tourism within the World Heritage Site, and then they host sporting events and sponsor things like the US Open and the America's Cup and things like that. And so there's been this dramatic reorientation, as you all know, in the Caribbean and in Charleston toward tourism and hospitality industry. And so what have they done? So they've gotten a World Heritage status for all of St. George's and all those fortifications from the 17th century. Those are now a part of the World Heritage nomination. And so the idea, as you know, Catherine and I were a part of the World Heritage working group when I was based in Charleston. The idea is that you get European travelers who are interested in this idea of World Heritage to get them to come to a specific location. And so Fort St. Catherine is one of the jewels within that fortification landscape. Here are all those fortifications that we mentioned before, which are now inscribed as a part of that World Heritage status in addition to the town. So this cross-cuts 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century fortifications. Fort St. Catherine's is now a major museum that you can visit on the eastern end, but it is under threat now from a new hotel, which is within the World Heritage buffer area. This over here on the left, the St. Regis, just opened this past week, actually, and you can see how close it is to the 19th century iteration of St. Catherine's Fort. This is Gates Bay. This is where they came on shore after the wreck of the Sea Venture, and now it is still a public beach, but you have a 4-star, $450 a night hotel that is steps from the ocean. I won't comment on that officially, given that this is being recorded. I've been very active in working with the World Heritage Site Management Group in trying to find the best path forward, because, you know, in many ways, not to get off track, there is this sort of compromise one has to make between the heritage industry and the tourism industry, and what's best for the broader society and economic viability of a place like Bermuda, which is now tied to the tourism industry, you know, in the same way that Jamaica or Barbados is. And so we all have to have sort of compromises moving forward. I actually did the archaeological mitigation assessment of this, looking for 17th century features. Unfortunately, I came up empty-handed. And so I signed the piece of paper essentially that said that they could build this hotel. As I mentioned before, Fort Hamilton has become the subject of potential hotels. And then in the dockyard now, the crown jewel of the Royal Navy, is now the home to cruise ships coming in. And so you get the world's best on, and this says nothing against cruisers, but you get people coming off cruise ships and invading dockyard in ways that are not properly managed in terms of those heritage resources. The Commissioner's House has now was initially the Maritime Museum, now is the National Museum of Bermuda, housing the largest heritage collections on the island. And they've done a series of documentation projects to attempt to manage those resources. You can see here many of the magazines that have been laser scanned by Wolfgang Neubauer from the University of Vienna in partnership with this. So those are sort of the challenges of management and heritage tourism in the 21st century that places like Bermuda and places like Charleston are constantly. I still read the Post-Courier and see, oh, there's another crane going up, there's another hotel going up. All those are management practices that we need to think about when managing these heritage resources. So to wind up, I have only talked for 55 minutes through 100 slides. For further reading on this, I cannot encourage you enough to go read Edward Harris's Bermuda Forts, which marches through the history from 1612 all the way until 1957 when the garrison leaves. And then for sort of this broader view, Bill Clements' book, which has probably been mentioned in previous lectures, talks about this defensive empire from 1756 up until 1956 as well. Those are two great resources to think about these resources within the early modern period. So thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to sort of answer any questions. I apologize. That was a whirlwind tour.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Really, really wonderful. And I know we've got a couple of questions. I was sort of thinking snarkily as you were talking that it's too bad with all these fortifications that they couldn't defend against cruise ships coming in, but that's just me.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that strikes me is you did, I guess, have this paranoia and idle hands and all this fortification, but this is on a massive scale. So, I mean, it's first the company that's financing this and then later the royal government. But I mean, who is sort of signing off on this? Is a very expensive proposition in all of these eras, correct, for a place that was never attacked. It seems so weird.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that, you know, I've written about in some publications that talk about the challenges of heritage studies in Bermuda is that the one thing that we have to remember is that all those 17th century forts were constructed using the labor of enslaved Africans. And so they are underrepresented in the World Heritage nomination. They're underrepresented in the heritage interpretation of the island. Various sites, and you know, myself and others have been working very hard to make them more equitably represented in the heritage interpretations. And so that's the one thing to think about, the labor associated with those 17th century forts. On the flip side, the dockyard is constructed almost exclusively with convict labor that is being used throughout the empire in the 19th century after emancipation. And so there is a Boer cemetery on Bermuda because Boers were shipped from South Africa to Bermuda to be a part of the fortification construction project. And so in the 19th century, it really is a matter of necessity for the empire, particularly after they've lost all of those North American holdings, that they have to invest in some place to service the North Atlantic fleet, and Bermuda happens to be that place. And so it was out of necessity for the British in the early 19th century.
And I guess thinking about manpower too, Mitchell was asking, about the military men necessary to defend all these places, because even after the construction, you've got to house and feed and kind of maintain all these troops. Are these, he wanted to know if there were enough military aged men to man all these forts at the same time, or did the manpower rotate where needed?
Lots of rotation, and a lot of it is just for show. A fort might be garrisoned with just a couple men, not enough to actually operationalize it. And so if there was a threat that could be seen from a long way off because of the nature of the island, you could begin to move resources. But everyday Bermudians in the 19th century in particular, if the North Atlantic garrison hadn't come to the island, it would essentially have become a backwater, because its agricultural industry completely goes away. The maritime trade, with New York and Philadelphia taking more prominent place within that, and Boston and Charleston in the early 19th century, Bermuda would have become a backwater. And so it's only because of that do you have the local industry, and the locals are being supported by the garrison. And that's particularly true in the extreme west, in the extreme east, throughout that period. And so it really is, if not for this paranoia and not for the necessity of losing the American Revolution, Bermuda would have probably become a backwater, like not a backwater in a condescending way, but in terms of focus and economic prosperity that many other places did not enjoy.
Well, speaking of the Revolutionary War, Roger pointed out, Roger's in St. Augustine, and he's our I think our resident expert on the American Revolution too. Little known fact, Bermuda was invited to send representatives to the First Continental Congress in September of 1774, and they declined.
Yep. And it was the locals, the Tuckers, wanted that to happen, but the British administrators were just, no, we're not doing this.
Kibosh on that.
And it really does talk, it really owes the fact that in, the late, well, I'll just say, we excavated at the State House. We excavated the privy in the State House as a part of my dissertation. And so what we found was, one thing that you have to remember, it wasn't just the familial connections of Bermuda, but most of the food that is coming to the middle and upper elite in Bermuda were coming from Eastern North America. And so we get cattle coming in that we find excavated from archaeological sites that are coming from the Eastern Seaboard. They're not eating fish. Fish is a lower class food at this point. They're importing all this good food from North America. And so it's not just familial, it is economic. It's the economy of food and provisions that are provisioning the island during this period.
Talk a little bit about, one of the things I need to read more about is the gunpowder situation there with the Bermudian powder. And what, here I sit in front of this view of the powder magazine in Charleston, but does that Bermudian powder, do we know if it ends up, any of it ends up at this place behind me?
It probably likely did, actually.
Yeah, interesting. One of the things too that was kind of interesting in learning more about the powder magazine here was that in Charleston, for I don't know how many years, there was actually an import fee. So if you bring a ship into Charleston, you're having to pay a tax in gunpowder for the community store of gunpowder. Anything like that in Bermuda, or is it just all, because it's all governmental and military, they're just bringing in lots of gunpowder?
I don't know. I do know that one of the big things that Bermudians also did was, there is this legal trade, But then because of the nature of the island with all these navigable harbors and inlets, there's a huge illegal trade at the same time. And so if we were talking about domestic architecture, we've drawn buildings that, have domestic residents up top and then store spaces below, much like you get in places like Falmouth, in Speightstown, in Bridgetown. And so there's this huge illegal trade that's happening outside of the customs system. And so they're bringing stuff in and out constantly. They're trading with the French, they're trading with the Dutch, they're trading with the Spanish. It's all sort of this front stage, back of stage in terms of the illegal economy that Bermuda plays a huge role in.
It's so interesting. Well, we got lots of people saying thank you and grazie. I think Judy has been tuning in from Italy, and she's been lucky duck, been going to things in Spoleto.
Now is the time to go to Italy. If you, there are COVID test flights from Atlanta on Delta right now. I mean, I just want to go to, I want to go to, sites in Rome where there aren't people.
That's another trip we need to do is have a fortification trip between us and some of the European walled cities. So we'll see that. Mike says, how do they play golf when it rains 28 days a month?
It doesn't rain all day. It rains for about 10 minutes and then it doesn't. So
Judy did say that people are not in Rome, or no, they're out in Rome big time. So we may have missed our window, but a great presentation from John Jameson and from Roger in St. Augustine. Everybody saying they really enjoyed it. And I did too. This has been so great. And for those of you who are still sticking around, what we're going to try and do, because all of our speakers have graciously agreed to be recorded, at a certain point, we're going to make these recordings available all together so that you can really kind of see them all marched up together. And I think there's so much, again, that we can all learn from each other about fortifications and walled cities and design and engineering, but also the sort of socio-political scene in the colonial period, what we call the colonial period in the 18th century. But there's so much here that I think we've been able to discover with just these 4 talks. And I really appreciate everybody. Thank you, Brent, and thanks to Roger and Nick and Eric. And hopefully we'll have these recordings together pretty soon. So,
and I should say just one plug for something. So I'll be a part of the Keeping History Above Water conference in a couple of weeks in Charleston. So if you're interested in, the side of, how do we make these heritage resources more durable and resilient? I'm in a great panel with Marty Hilton from Florida, and some others, Elisa Craig, working on how we can leverage technology to come up with better resilient strategies for heritage resources. So it should be a great conference. I don't know if it's closed yet, but I believe it's at South Carolina Society Hall, which is a great venue for this kind of stuff. So it's in person, getting back to things.
Even tours. We're going to do a walled city tour to
talk about
high ground. So, all right. Well, again, thanks everybody for hanging in there with us and for learning about fortifications with us. And hopefully we'll put together more of these as time goes on, and we'll just keep on learning. So thanks everybody again. And please let us know what you thought of the series. And I'll be sending out links to recordings pretty soon. But anyway, thanks again and see you all soon. Thanks, Brent. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thanks, Brent.
Take care. Good seeing
See
you,
you
Nick.
soon.